Have you ever felt invisible in your own family, like you're both a part of the story and always on the edge of every photograph? My name is Claire Morrison, and if you've ever wondered where you truly belong, you might recognize yourself in my story. I grew up in a small Michigan town where the quiet hum of summer crickets and the smell of fresh-cut grass became the backdrop to my childhood. My mother, a nurse with gentle hands and a laugh that could melt the coldest winter morning, was my whole world, at least until the day she remarried. When Daniel came into our lives, I was 9 years old and hungry for stability. He wasn't my biological father, but from the start, he showed up in every way that mattered. Daniel was the kind of man who fixed leaky faucets, told the world's worst dad jokes, and taught me how to ride a bike on cracked sidewalks behind our house. I remember thinking, maybe this is what real family feels like: messy, imperfect, but safe. Those early years were golden, stitched together by birthday cakes, Sunday picnics, and Daniel's steady presence at every parent-teacher night. Then came Ethan. My little brother arrived with a shock of blonde hair and the loudest cry in the hospital ward. I adored him from the start, and for a while it felt like the missing piece had clicked into place. We were a new family blended by choice, not just by blood. But as we all settled into our new roles, the invisible seams started to show. I learned quickly that no matter how much love fills a home, there's always a shadow, a question of where you fit when the lines aren't drawn in blood. Looking back, I see how hard Daniel tried to make us feel equal. He called me his daughter, not his stepdaughter, and cheered just as loud for my small victories as for Ethan's. Still, in the quiet moments after the laughter faded and the house fell silent, I sometimes wondered if I would ever really belong. It's a feeling I think many people in blended families know too well. You try to be grateful for what you have, but there's a part of you always standing just outside the circle, watching the glow from a distance. If I could go back and talk to that little girl on the porch, I'd tell her that love is rarely simple and families aren't built in straight lines. I'd tell her that the ache of wanting to belong is a quiet teacher, one that shows up in the small acts, packing school lunches, waiting for someone to come home, hoping to be chosen. For a while, those hopes kept me afloat. I clung to the rituals: Saturday morning pancakes, summer fireworks, the comfort of Daniel's steady voice saying, "You're one of us, Claire. Always." But families, even the happiest ones, are never safe from change. When loss came for us, it didn't knock gently, it crashed in, upending every rule we thought was unbreakable. What happened next taught me that the things we take for granted can disappear overnight, and that sometimes the people we love most can become strangers almost as quickly. This is the story of how I lost everything I thought I needed and discovered the strength to build a new life, one small step, and one unexpected kindness at a time. Before I share how everything unraveled, I want to thank you for being here, for listening. If you've ever felt like an outsider in your own home, or if you're piecing together your own family from the fragments of loss, I hope you'll find a little hope in what comes next. Let's begin at the place where my world first changed, where love and grief started shaping who I would become. It happened on a night so ordinary that I still find it hard to believe how quickly everything changed. One moment I was sitting at the kitchen table with Daniel laughing over burnt cookies and Ethan's off-key rendition of Happy Birthday for our neighbor's cat. The next, the phone rang, a stranger's voice trembling as she explained there'd been an accident on the rain-slicked highway outside town. My mother, the woman whose hands had healed countless patients, was gone in an instant, taken by a drunk driver who never saw her car until it was too late. I remember the chill that settled over the room, the sound of Daniel's mug shattering on the floor, and Ethan's confused, frightened questions cutting through the silence. In those first days, the world blurred. People brought casseroles, filled our living room with whispered condolences and awkward hugs. But nothing could touch the ache that wrapped around my chest. Daniel moved through the motions, like a man underwater, paying bills, signing papers, barely sleeping. Ethan was only 9, too young to understand the permanence of loss. At the funeral, he clung to Daniel with wide, wet eyes, then turned on me with a fury I'd never seen before. "Why wasn't it you?" He screamed, his voice raw, his grief searching for somewhere to land. The words sliced through me, leaving wounds I wouldn't know how to heal for years. It's strange the ways families react to grief. Some pull together, finding strength in each other. Others fracture under the weight, everyone retreating into their own pain. In our house, silence grew heavy and sharp. Daniel tried to hold us together, but he was grieving too. Sometimes he'd reach for my mother in his sleep, mumbling her name, then wake with tears on his cheeks. I tried to be the strong one, taking care of Ethan, making sure he ate, helping with homework. But nothing I did was enough to fill the space she'd left behind. And every day, Ethan's resentment toward me seemed to deepen. Years later, I read a story about a family from Iowa who lost their father suddenly. The oldest son, only 17, stepped up to care for his younger siblings. At first, he held everything together, but as time wore on, the pressure fractured their bond. Old wounds resurfaced, blame replaced comfort, and what had once been a close-knit family became strangers sharing a roof. I saw echoes of our own struggle in their story. The way loss can twist love into something unrecognizable, the way children can become both victims and unwitting antagonists. What I learned from that time is that grief isn't just about missing someone. It's about the changes it brings, the way it can redraw the boundaries of family sometimes overnight. I spent years wishing I could take back that moment at the funeral, erase Ethan's words from my memory. But I've come to realize that pain doesn't disappear because we ignore it. It just waits hidden until we're ready to face it and eventually let it go. If you're grieving now, know this: your pain is valid, and the messy, angry, lonely ways you feel are all part of the process. Be gentle with yourself and those around you, even if it feels impossible. As the seasons turned, our family's wounds never quite healed, but we learned to live around them. Daniel did his best, but the house never felt whole again. I threw myself into school and caring for Ethan, hoping things would get better with time. But the cracks in our foundation only grew deeper. Looking back, I can see that was the moment our paths started to diverge. Ethan growing more distant and angry, me clinging to the hope that love alone could fix what was broken. I couldn't have known then how much farther we would drift, or how the choices we made in those dark days would shape the rest of our lives. And yet that's where the next chapter truly begins. As time edged forward, the weight of loss pressed Ethan and me in different directions. In the beginning, I tried to reach for my little brother the way our mother might have, making his favorite grilled cheese, sitting through his endless cartoons, waiting for the flicker of the old Ethan to return. But grief, I learned, doesn't always unite it, sometimes divides, carving invisible lines between people who once shared everything. Each week, Ethan drifted further, letting his anger replace what should have been sorrow. If I asked how his day had gone, he'd shrug or snap. "You're not my real sister anyway." Every harsh word felt like another thread snapping in the fragile tapestry of our family. It was in those quiet afternoons when Daniel was still at work, and the house was filled only with Ethan's silence, that I started to feel like an outsider. I'd hear him on the phone with friends complaining about my stepsister Claire, and how annoying it was to have someone always checking up on him. At first, I chalked it up to the wild mood swings of adolescence. But as the months passed, I realized the divide between us was growing deeper, rooted in something neither of us knew how to name. The love and trust we'd built as children seemed lost to a fog of old hurt and misunderstood blame. I remember reading about another blended family in Minnesota, a mother who remarried when her son was 7. After the sudden death of her new husband, her son lashed out at his step-siblings, blaming them for every lost comfort. The mother described the heartbreak of watching her children become adversaries, knowing she couldn't force healing or closeness. That story stuck with me, a quiet reminder that grief can fracture even the strongest bonds, especially in families pieced together by choice rather than blood. Looking back, I wish someone had told me how normal it was to feel both desperate and helpless. I thought if I just tried harder, helped Ethan with homework, stayed patient during his tantrums, made myself useful, he'd eventually see that I was on his side. But the truth is, love alone can't always reach someone drowning in anger. That's a lesson many people in blended families learn too late. Sometimes the harder you try to force closeness, the further apart you drift. The walls go up, and every word feels like an attack or a defense. For a while, Daniel tried to bridge the gap, urging us to spend time together, planning family dinners and weekend outings. He'd pull me aside and say, "Be patient with Ethan, Claire. He's hurting more than he knows how to show." And I'd nod, carrying the responsibility, quietly hoping things would change. But with each passing year, the roles in our family hardened: Ethan, the wounded and defiant youngest; Daniel, the exhausted peacekeeper; me, the perpetual outsider, desperate to belong yet always on the periphery. If you've ever found yourself in a family where grief turns siblings into strangers, you know how lonely it can feel. The lesson I carry from those years is this: sometimes the best you can do is stand steady in your own truth and leave the door open even if no one comes through. Compassion is not the same as self-sacrifice, and setting boundaries is not an act of betrayal. Loving someone doesn't mean letting their pain destroy you. As I moved toward adulthood, those early wounds shaped every choice I made. The harder I tried to hold us together, the more I realized I couldn't heal Ethan's grief for him. In the end, our story was no longer about a single tragedy, but about the slow unraveling of what we once believed was unbreakable. That realization, painful as it was, pushed me toward the next crossroads in my life, a journey to find belonging outside the walls of the only home I'd ever known. By my early 20s, I understood that sometimes loving someone from a distance is the only way to survive. The tension at home had become suffocating, a sharp reminder each morning that some wounds heal best when given space. When I moved out, it was into a one-bedroom apartment above a busy cafe in the heart of our small city. The freedom was exhilarating and terrifying at once. I filled my days with work at the community center, running after-school programs for kids who reminded me so much of Ethan at his gentlest. If I couldn't fix my own family, maybe I could help someone else keep theirs together. It's funny how life sometimes offers you the chance to become the person you once needed. There was a little girl named Brianna in my reading club, quiet and withdrawn, always clutching a tattered stuffed bunny. She rarely spoke, but she'd glance up whenever I knelt beside her, searching my face as if asking if I could be trusted. One day, after everyone else had left, she handed me a note. "Thank you for not giving up." I kept that note for years. It reminded me that even when our own hearts feel empty, we still have something to offer. Sometimes the best way to heal is to help someone else feel less alone. In building a life apart from Daniel and Ethan, I learned that family is sometimes found, not given. The staff at the community center became my support network. We shared takeout on late nights, swapped stories about childhoods both happy and hard, and cheered each other's small victories. I realized that so many people in our city were also searching for a sense of belonging: migrants who missed home, teens estranged from parents, widows learning how to be alone. We created our own patchwork family, stitched together by empathy and laughter rather than bloodlines. But even surrounded by kindness, I carried guilt. Was I abandoning Daniel by leaving? Should I have fought harder for Ethan's love, or tried to be a better sister? These questions haunted my quiet moments, especially on holidays, when memories pressed in with the smell of roasting turkey or the twinkle of old Christmas lights. With time, I understood that carrying guilt doesn't bring healing, it only deepens the ache. It's a lesson I see repeated everywhere, especially among women who take on the emotional labor of their families, believing their worth is measured in how well they hold everyone together. Letting go of that burden was one of the hardest and most necessary steps of my life. A few years ago, I read about a woman in Oregon who started a support group for people who'd been rejected by their families. She talked about the power of chosen family, the friends, mentors, and communities who step in to fill the spaces left empty by loss or estrangement. Her story reminded me that sometimes family is less about shared DNA than about the people who choose to show up. For me, healing meant opening my heart to that possibility, even if it wasn't the family I'd first imagined. By the time I'd settled into my new rhythm: work, friends, the occasional call with Daniel, I felt stronger than I had in years. I'd found purpose and a kind of quiet pride in helping others, even as the ache of what I'd lost lingered. Yet life has a way of testing the lessons you think you've learned. Just as I began to feel at home in my own skin, a new loss would come barreling in, threatening the fragile sense of peace I'd built. And so, as the next chapter unfolded, I found myself once again standing at the crossroads of grief and resilience, searching for a way forward. The call from the hospital came on a pale March morning. I was sorting books for a literacy drive when my phone buzzed, and I knew from the nurse's gentle voice before she spoke that something had gone wrong. Daniel, my steady anchor, had suffered a heart attack in his sleep. I drove to the hospital in a daze, the world blurring past in gray smudges, bracing myself for the news I'd always feared. Grief, I found, doesn't get easier with practice. Losing my mother was an open wound. Losing Daniel felt like losing the last part of my childhood, the last person who'd called me his girl without hesitation. Arranging the funeral became my way of holding on to sanity. I combed through old photo albums, picking out Daniel's favorite snapshots. The one where we're both covered in flour baking bread, another of him grinning beside a battered tent on a family camping trip. I wrote his eulogy at the kitchen table, tears blurring my pen, struggling to capture the quiet, everyday love he'd given us. At the service, people shared stories about Daniel's kindness, how he'd plow neighbors' driveways after a snowstorm, fix a broken porch light, without asking for thanks, or just listen without judgment when someone needed to talk. Ethan arrived late, dressed sharply, but with a cold, distant stare. He sat in the back row, arms crossed, not meeting my eyes. When it was my turn to speak, I glanced at him, hoping for a sign that we might still be family somehow. But he looked away, jaw tight. After the service, he muttered a few words to Daniel's friends, then disappeared before I could even say goodbye. That moment broke my heart all over again. Not just for what we'd lost, but for the love Ethan and I could never seem to find again. After the funeral, the reality of Daniel's passing settled over me in the form of paperwork. There were savings to account for a small house filled with decades of memories and debts Daniel had quietly accumulated to pay for Ethan's college and keep the mortgage afloat. As I sat at Daniel's old desk, leafing through stacks of bank statements and bills, I realized how much he'd sacrificed, never complaining, always making sure Ethan and I had what we needed. It was another kind of love, silent and invisible, the kind that often goes unnoticed until it's too late to say thank you. I remember reading a story once about a woman in Vermont who discovered after her father's death that he'd taken out 3 jobs to support her through college. She only found out by sorting through his papers and receipts. Her grief was tangled up with gratitude and guilt, emotions I understood far too well as I handled Daniel's estate. These silent acts of love are so common in families, parents stretching themselves thin, children not realizing the cost, until they're left with memories and regret. What I learned from those days is that grief brings old wounds to the surface. It's a harsh teacher reminding us not just of what we've lost, but of what we never said or did. For me, it was the urge to reach out to Ethan to try one last time to bridge the gulf between us. But I also knew that some distances can't be closed by willpower alone. As I prepared to face the realities of inheritance and family, I understood that Daniel's final gift was teaching me how to let go with love and to trust that whatever happened next, I was strong enough to survive it. With that, the stage was set for the battle over Daniel's legacy and the test of what family truly means. Sorting out Daniel's estate felt like stepping into a maze of legal terms and hidden emotions. At first, I approached the task with methodical calm, listing his assets, calling the bank, checking the mortgage status on the house I'd grown up in. The numbers were sobering. There was a little savings, but also a significant mortgage, and several loans Daniel had quietly taken to help Ethan through college. The paperwork felt heavy in my hands, as if each page held not just dollars and cents, but years of sacrifice and silent worry. I wondered how many parents quietly take on burdens for their children, never asking for recognition. Ethan's reaction was swift and sharp. He called one afternoon, voice clipped and accusing, demanding to know the details of the will. "You know you're not really part of this family," he said, the words landing with old bitterness. "Dad only cared about you because of Mom." The pain in his voice was familiar, but it cut no less deep. I tried to explain legally Daniel had adopted me, making me his daughter as much as Ethan was his son. But for Ethan, the law meant little. Family to him was blood and history, not paper. Stories like ours aren't uncommon. I once read about siblings in Ohio who stopped speaking for decades after their stepfather's will named all children, not just his biological son, as equal heirs. Courts and counselors often warn that inheritances can reopen old wounds or create new ones, especially in blended families. What should be a final act of love becomes a minefield of resentment and rivalry. For us, the question wasn't just who got what, it was who truly belonged, and whether love or legality decided the answer. As the arguments grew, so did my exhaustion. Ethan wanted everything, insisting the house and whatever remained should be his. I could have fought, and maybe some would say I should have. But every conversation with Ethan felt like reliving the pain of losing our parents all over again. In the end, I made a decision that surprised even me. I offered to renounce my share of the inheritance, asking only that Ethan leave me in peace. Friends and colleagues were shocked. "That's your future," Claire once said. Why let him take it all? I couldn't fully explain the relief I felt, as if setting down a weight I'd carried too long. There's a lesson hidden in all this sometimes. The greatest freedom is letting go of money, of old hurts, of the impossible task of proving yourself to someone who refuses to see you. No legal document can grant the sense of belonging we crave. No amount of money can buy peace of mind. What mattered most was Daniel's love, and the quiet faith he had in me, something Ethan, for all his anger, would never be able to erase. The paperwork was filed, signatures witnessed, and just like that, my ties to the house I grew up in and to Ethan's ongoing battle were severed. I left the lawyer's office with mixed feelings. Sadness, yes, but also a lightness I hadn't felt in years. As I walked out into the late afternoon sun, I wondered what would come next now that the last material bond to my family had been cut. It turned out the true test wasn't over. The past has a way of chasing us down, especially when we think we've finally found peace. Renouncing my share of the inheritance brought both relief and uncertainty. I thought, perhaps naively, that signing those papers would put the past behind me. For a while it did. I returned to my routine at the community center, pouring my energy into helping children with homework and organizing neighborhood food drives. The absence of legal and financial battles was like a deep breath, after years of holding it in. I told myself that I'd chosen peace, and for a few quiet weeks, I almost believed it. But healing, I would learn, is rarely so tidy. Ethan's resentment didn't disappear when the paperwork did. If anything, it seemed to flare brighter, fueled by old wounds and his own mounting struggles. One afternoon, he sent a terse email demanding money to cover unexpected debts. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, remembering all the years I'd tried to make things right between us. The difference now was, I didn't respond. I blocked his address, promising myself that protecting my boundaries wasn't cruelty but self-respect. It's a lesson that takes many of us a lifetime to learn. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is say enough and let the chips fall where they may. Stories like ours are not so rare. I once read about a teacher in Kentucky who, after years of supporting her brother through addiction, finally had to cut off all contact to save her own sanity. She described the heartbreak of watching someone she loved spiral and the guilt that lingered long after. What struck me most was her relief at finally claiming her own life back. Her courage echoed in my decision to walk away, not with anger, but with the hope of building something new and healthy. Still, guilt crept in, especially during quiet evenings when memories of happier times with Ethan would surface. I wondered if there was more I could have done, or if letting go meant giving up on family altogether. I think many people, especially those from tight-knit communities, carry that same burden. But the truth is, not all relationships are meant to last forever. Some are meant to teach us when to hold on and when to walk away for our own well-being. A small but powerful lesson began to take root. I was allowed to put my own healing first. I didn't have to play the peacemaker in a battle I never asked for. The world didn't end when I stopped fighting for a brother who no longer wanted me in his life. Instead, my world grew quieter, softer, and more spacious. I started to fill that space with simple joys, fresh flowers on my windowsill, coffee dates, with friends' long walks in the early morning mist. I began to remember who I was before the weight of family drama consumed me. Letting go didn't mean I stopped caring. I still wished Ethan well, hoped he'd find his own path to peace. But I also knew finally that my future wasn't tethered to his choices or his pain. That knowledge was its own kind of freedom, a gift I never expected. As I leaned into this new chapter, I couldn't have known that the past wasn't finished with me yet. Sometimes the things we think we've left behind come back, asking us to face them one more time, this time with a heart finally strong enough to choose itself. I thought renouncing my inheritance would close the chapter on family strife. But the past rarely respects clean endings. Just as I began to reclaim peace, Ethan's world started to unravel. Word filtered through old friends and distant cousins. Ethan had lost his job, defaulted on his car payments, and was now drowning in debt from loans he'd never mentioned to anyone. Soon the phone calls began, first from numbers I didn't recognize, then from Ethan himself, desperate and angry. Each message swung wildly between pleading for help and blaming me for abandoning family. I listened once, then twice, hoping for the brother I'd loved to surface beneath the hurt and frustration. But every conversation felt like a tug of war I could never win. It's a strange ache watching someone you care about spiral out of control, while knowing there's little you can do. I remembered a woman I'd met at the community center, Maria, whose adult son struggled with addiction. She'd tried for years to save him, attending court hearings, paying his rent, and even taking out loans in her own name. Eventually, Maria made the gut-wrenching choice to step back. She told me that letting go was harder than any sacrifice she'd made, but it was the only way she could protect herself and her younger children from sinking too. Her strength stayed with me whenever I questioned my own resolve. Ethan's troubles escalated, sometimes spilling into my professional life. He would show up at the community center wild-eyed and disheveled, begging to see me between youth workshops or waiting outside my apartment late at night. I had to ask a coworker to walk me to my car on more than one occasion. The experience was both frightening and heartbreaking. This was the same boy I used to push on the swing in our backyard, now a stranger I barely recognized. In moments like those, I was reminded that love and safety aren't always the same thing, and sometimes protecting yourself means drawing boundaries you never wanted to make. A small but profound lesson became clear to me then: compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice. I could hope for Ethan's healing, but I was not responsible for saving him. Many people, especially those from families with deep wounds, believe that loyalty means accepting any kind of pain. But true love respects both sides, giving but also allowing space for growth, or for someone to face their own consequences. My story with Ethan taught me that forgiveness sometimes means letting people walk their own paths, even when those paths are dark and uncertain. Eventually, with advice from friends and my supervisor, I changed my number and moved to a new neighborhood, craving the safety and quiet my soul needed to recover. Each day, the distance grew between the life I'd built for myself and the turmoil Ethan carried with him. I mourned what could have been, but I also honored the courage it took to choose a different future. And so, as I packed up my things for a fresh start, I realized that real healing doesn't erase the past. It teaches you to live forward one gentle, hopeful day at a time. The next chapter would take me someplace entirely new, where I would learn that family at its best is something you build for yourself. When I finally left the city for good, it wasn't with bitterness, but with a sense of quiet anticipation. My new position at a rural community center in the northern part of the state offered not just a fresh job, but a whole new rhythm of life. The first morning there, the air was crisp and clean, and the silence was broken only by birds and the laughter of children running through dewy grass. It was a slower world, one where neighbors stopped by with homemade pies, and kids called out greetings from their porches. For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of peace, the gentle promise that I could start over. The work was simple but meaningful, helping local farmers with paperwork, organizing literacy workshops in the church basement, and delivering meals to elderly residents who lived alone. There was something deeply healing about being needed in ways that had nothing to do with old wounds or family history. A retired teacher named Mrs. Jensen often joined me on my deliveries. She had lost her husband years ago and knew what it meant to build a new life from the ground up. Over coffee one afternoon, she shared how the community had become her chosen family people she'd leaned on and laughed with, who made her feel seen and valued even without blood ties. This idea of a chosen family began to take root in me. I realized that family could mean the people who show up for you day after day, not just the ones you're born to. I watched as local volunteers supported one another during harvest season, or when someone fell ill, or when a new baby arrived. There were traditions and rituals, kindnesses both big and small, that wove everyone together. It struck me that in many American towns, especially those far from the city's rush, People reinvent the idea of home and kin every day out of necessity and hope. In those first few months, I also saw a pattern in the stories around me. Many people had come here after loss, divorce, estrangement, or the simple ache of outgrowing their old lives. A man named Ted, who ran the hardware store, shared how he'd left Chicago after a painful breakup, eventually finding his feet and his laughter in this quiet valley. Each story was a quiet reassurance that starting over wasn't a mark of failure, but a sign of resilience. Their courage gave me permission to be gentle with myself, to trust that healing didn't have to mean erasing the past, just learning to carry it differently. The lesson from those early days was simple but powerful. Belonging isn't something handed to us, but something we create moment by moment. Every pie shared, every ride, given every shared laugh and listening ear, added another brick to the sense of home I was building for myself. I didn't need to pretend my story had been easy or perfect. The truth was enough, and in sharing that truth with others, I began to see how deeply connection can heal. Little by little, my days filled up with new friendships, small joys, and a gratitude that no longer depended on anyone else's approval. It was in the gentle rhythm of service, community, and acceptance that I finally found a sense of home. And as the seasons turned again, I knew I was ready at last to share my story and to open the door to whatever might come next. Because healing, I realized, is never the end of the story. It's the foundation for something beautifully new.